Okay, so my clock says that I should start talking. Oops. So I'm going to do that, and I've got a million things to cover, so I'm going to speak really quickly today, if that's okay. And anybody not Swedish speaking in the room? Any English speakers? Okay. So, holy. Okay. Lots of non-Swedish people in the room. So let's keep it in English then. Hi, my name is Chris Klug. I work at a company called Active Solution. You don't care about me. What? However, I do want to mention I work for Active Solution. We have a booth outside where you can come out and donate trees. You come out, you do nothing, and we donate trees. All you have to do is put a sticker on the little tree, and we'll donate some trees to Ethiopia, I think. So that's kind of cool. So please come and do that. Let's do some demos. That was all I had in the way of PowerPoints because I do believe this is supposed to be a sort of a deep dive session, so I want to go deep. So I want to look at some ASP.NET Core features that most people have maybe played with or have never seen. I have built this little app that looks like this. How beautiful is that? It looks like I'm using Bootstrap, and I am. And you can go in and you can see information about Lamar, and you can go in and you can see information about Gracehopper. Not very impressive, but this is the website I'm going to work with. And one of the things in here is I kind of dislike URLs that look like that. /users/1. Not a very great way to have your URLs because SEO is going to not like that, and also it looks ugly if you actually look up in the address bar, which some people do. So what I want to do is I want to make sure that you can come in here and go to /HeadyLamar instead and get the response back. And the question is, how can we do that in an easy way? Well, very, very simple. Since we got a request pipeline in ASP.NET Core that uses an OWIN-like pipeline, we've got this configure method here. So I can just jump straight in here, and we can say that. So I'm going to explain what that does. So seeing that we have a request pipeline, oops, I need one more thing first. I need to have dependency injection of a little repo here of users called users iUsers. Since we have a request pipeline in ASP.NET Core, it means that we can jump in and we can manage all of the incoming and outgoing requests. So we don't have to go and use something like MVC or anything bigger. We can go straight into that pipeline and do whatever we want. So in this case, I'm saying that, hey, part of my pipeline should look at my incoming request. Look at the path, figure out if there is more than one character, and if there's more than one character, it looks at if there's more than one slash. If there is, then don't. But if there's just slash and something, then there's a single path element in here. I pull that out, I replace the dash in my URL with a space, and then I find a user based on that name. And then the kind of cool thing is this. Since the context for my request here, the path variable here is actually a get set. So I can just change the path in my request. So even though the request comes in with one path, that thing is writable. So I can just go in and make changes to it, and any middleware that comes in after my middleware will see the new path. So here, I take a path that looks like X, I rewrite that to something that looks like Y, which is what the rest of my pipeline needs. In this case, replacing a name with an ID, and then everything else is the same. I'm still using MVC underneath the hood. So MVC, since it's after my request, will see that new version of the path. So if I go out here, I can go and say /Gracehopper, and there it is. Woo-woo. Not very impressive. Okay. It's kind of cool. I just like that as a quick intro because most people apparently don't seem to understand that we can modify a bunch of things in our request pipelines very, very easy. We just plug in, make the changes that we want, and every middleware that comes afterwards will basically have that change and not see that change value instead. However, this looks like crap. Doing inline middlewares like this is very much not the way to go. It becomes really ugly very fast unless you're making something really small that can stay in here. But generally, having all of this in your config startup file in your configure method will just not look very good, and it will be hard to read. So what we generally do is we don't go to that one, we go to that one. We create our own middlewares. So how many of you have actually tried creating your own custom middleware? That was way less than I had thought, so that's cool. Middlewares like that. Doesn't spell like that at all. And for some reason, I don't get a caret when I do this, so that was the wrong one. L-E, that looks better. And then we'll go in here, I'm going to create a new middleware. I'm going to call it, it's going to be a new class. It's going to be called name routing middleware. So am I the only one that never gets a caret in here, so you can't see where you're actually in this thing here? Anyone seen that before? Okay, thank you. I'm at least not alone. It still sucks because it makes it impossible to retype things. Oh, I like that excuse. So it's because I type too fast. So I'm going to go in here. I'm going to say name routing middleware. I'm just going to plug that in there. So what we see here is a basic middleware. So the middleware, there's no interface for your middleware. It's just a class that takes a request delegate as a constructor parameter, and it has a method called invoke async that returns task. And the invoke async takes an HTTP context. So all you need for a middleware. And in my case, I need my users. So I'm going to have a users repo here that we can pull in like that. And then I've learned that you press not F2 anymore, but Control RR. And I have issues. It needs to be named like that. And once we have that in place, we can go and say the invoke async method, which is pretty much the same code I had in my startup file, right? I just copied across this if statement, the same implementation, and then I call await next to basically say execute the rest of the middleware in the pipeline. With that in place, I can now go out to my startup file and I can remove all of this app.use. So I can make this a much nicer experience and say app.use middleware, and then I can tell it that I want to use my name routing middle, if I could spell. Come on. There it is, that one. So using statement on that. That looks much nicer, right? The thing is that still looks pretty less than awesome because everybody's used to app use routing, app use endpoints, app use static files. So obviously we should have that experience, right? If you see that the framework is offering you something out of the box, then you should try and replicate that as much as possible. So that means that we need to make a little extension method. I'm going to go to my class here. I'm going to create on my folder, create a new class called something useful, middleware's extensions. Doesn't matter what it's called. You can name it whatever. The main thing that I do in here, which people find a little bit weird, is I actually changed my namespace. And I changed the namespace to Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Builder, like that. And then I make my class static, so I can have extension methods. And then I have a static names. I thought I'd use name routing, that one. So all I'm doing is I'm moving my use middleware call into this extension method. And now, because I have this in this namespace here, it automatically pops up into my startup because that namespace is always available here because it's always going to be there in your project. And then instead of doing app.use middleware, we can say app.use name routing like that. Beautiful. And if I go back out here, I think it still works. It works. Cool. That was part one. Anybody not understand what I just did? If you don't understand what I did, we can have a chat afterwards. I don't have time to explain it. No, it's pretty basic. What we've done is just plugged in the same way that every other middleware in the system does. It plugs into the request pipeline, does something to the incoming request, and in my case, I take the incoming path, I replace it with another path, so that when I come to ASP.NET MVC, it sees the path it needs to figure out how to render, whereas externally on the website, I can have a completely different path. The last thing I want to talk about here is a slightly more weird feature that I didn't know existed until recently, and that's the fact all of your middlewares are actually singletons. So if you need to take, in my case, an iUsers repo in, that's going to be inside of this in a singleton fashion. So if you have a middleware that requires you to use scoped services, you are, I'm not going to say it, but you're kind of out of luck. because they're all singletons. And they were up until very recently. So if you want to switch your middlewares to actually not be singletons, you can do so as of a very late version of ASP.NET Core. I think it came in 3. And what we can do is we can change this thing here, and we can have it implement middleware, like that. And when we do that, we don't get the request delegate in the constructor anymore, because that would require it to be a singleton. And all we need is our users like this. We don't need that anymore. And then it changes my invoke async to require me to pass in both the HB context, and I get my request delegate down here. So that becomes the next one in the pipeline. And now this is going to be invoked in whatever scope that I want. So I have my own lifetime management. Once I have this changed, all I need to do is go back out here, and I actually need to go to my services collection here, and say services.add. In this case, I'm going to say transient. I don't know why, but it seems like a reasonable thing to do. Name routing middleware, like that. So you add your middleware to your service locator instead, or services collection instead. And then you just keep your registration as add middleware. And the way that we know that this works is that I can put a breakpoint in my constructor here. And if we start this, it failed. That is because that is not called underscore anymore. Now, as soon as my application starts, it breaks into my constructor. So you can see that on the first request, I did come into my constructor. So my middleware is obviously being used, right? But if I F5 out of that and I go back out here and I refresh again, you get another instance of that middleware. So instead of having your middlewares being singletons, you can now have them as transient or scoped, which opens up a whole bunch of features that you couldn't do previously. You would have to do some really weird workarounds with factories and things like that. And factories should stay in Java. Okay, let's move away from middlewares. Middlewares is, I like middlewares, but they're pretty common. Most people, or a lot of people seem to have tried them. The next thing I've got is I'm going to pull up a tool called Insomnia. So Insomnia is kind of Postman, but not Postman. It looks cooler than Postman. It has a cooler logo. And if I start my app again, after I debugged it, inside of Insomnia, I can now do requests. So I do have an API in here. So you can see up here, it goes to my website /API/users/1. And if I send that request, I get a JSON result back with information about Hedy Lamarr. I don't know if I can zoom this. I could, so you can see it in the back as well. That's kind of cool. And I know for a fact that you can have content negotiation in ASP.NET Core, right? So all I have to do is I need to go to my headers here and then say, hey, can you pass in an accept header called text with the value text/XML? And if I send that request, ASP.NET Core is going to give me JSON back. Yes, because out of the box nowadays, it doesn't actually support content negotiation, or it's not being set up properly. So whatever you pass into your accept header, ASP.NET Core is going to be nice enough to always return JSON to you. You have actually no content negotiation out of the box with ASP.NET Core. Luckily, we can fix that part fairly easily. Then I'm going to take it up a notch, and you're going to sit there and go, why would you do this? But let's start here. MVC is the one that controls output formatting because it's an ASP.NET web API. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in, I'm going to set up an options thing in here so that we can configure ASP.NET for us. And inside of options, we can say output formatters because you've got output formatters that are responsible for formatting your output. Yep, that's what they do. And we can go and say, hey, I have a new one of those. Then we can add a new XML serializer output formatter. If I spelled that right, I should get an award. I did. I was about to say that I should have a Nobel Prize, but I was aiming a bit too high. So if I go with this, I send in this with text XML again, and look at this. It comes back as XML. We all love XML, right? Okay, so what we need is text/YAML, and everybody would be really happy. It's even worse than JSON. So this is kind of cool. And I looked at this and I like that. I'm going to use this because I often end up, not often and often, that might be an exaggeration, but I once in a while end up in this scenario. I have this API here. I have my user controller. And inside of my user controller, there's an action here called getUser, and getUser returns a user object. But I find that my user object is a bit too big. I want to have a smaller version of that. Why? I don't know. I just want to have a smaller version, okay? I want a different version of the same resource. So in REST, that means that I should use the same URL. Adding versioning and things like that to your URL means that you're asking for two different resources, and I'm not really. I'm also asking for another version of the same resource. It's still the same user, but I want it with less properties on it. So if I wanted to do that, I could do something like this. You go new folder, models. In my models folder, I'll go and add a new class, and I'm going to call it basic user. Like that. And I'm going to have a basic user like that. And this is an ugly little thing. It's just an ID name, and there's a create method that takes a user and converts it into a smaller user object. And then once I have that, we should be able to go, let's collapse a few things so you can see a bit more in here. That's collapsed. Let's collapse that. Let's do get basic user. So what if I wanted this? What if I wanted to have another endpoint with the same address, with the same parameters, but I could get both a full user object and a smaller user object? Well, I can tell you straight away that that is not going to work. Because obviously I can't have two methods with the same endpoint, right? The same address is just going to collide. So what we can do, I went back and we looked at this accept header, and I really love the idea of using the accept header as my way of saying what version of this resource do I want to get back. So I want to be able to go in and use this format. I want to be able to go in and pass in an accept header, which is application/vnd.user, which is application specific, is a vendor-based object called user. That's what I want to have back. And when I pass that in, I want to get this basic user instead. So if I go default without an accept header, I get a full object. If I go with that specific header, I get a different one. I don't know, I thought that was really useful. So what I did, or what we can do, is we can go in, create a new folder. I'm going to call it infrastructure. Infrastructure. Can also be called miscellaneous, other stuff I don't know what to place and things like that. I'm going to call it infrastructure. And I'm going to add accept header attributes in here. And I'm going to add a little attribute in here that looks like this. So it's going to be an attribute. Duh, I named it attribute. So it's going to be inheriting from attributes. I'm going to have the target for methods, so you can only add it to methods. Then I'm going to implement iActionConstraint. Has anybody seen iActionConstraint before? One hand. Okay. What iActionConstraint allows us to do is have a method called accept, takes an action constraint context, and returns a Boolean. Based on this method here, I can go and say, if the request header, the accept header, includes basically a string that I pass in, then I return true. And then you can give it an order, so you can order your different attributes as well. This allows me to tell whether or not an action endpoint on a controller can actually be used for a request. So it's basically like a filter that I can put in place, and I can say, you have 3 different actions that all respond to the same path, and then ASP.NET Core is going to go and look at them one at a time, and if it finds an action constraint, it asks action constraint, are you valid for this request? And then you can say yes or no. So I have this little attribute here. It takes the header string that I want to use as an input, and then basically just compares the accept header against my configured value. With that in place, I can go to my controller here where I had this duplicate HTTP GET. All I need to do is pass in an accept. That didn't come out very well. Accept header. Let's not call it accept header attribute. Let's just call it accept header. Pull that in. And it wants a string, so I'm going to say apply application/vnd.user. So now I have two endpoints, both using the same htget template. And if I take this and I go out here, go out here, and I do a send, it now comes back as a small object. And if I remove my header, I can now have a large object. So this, you can imagine, can not only be used for this, we can have versioning in here. So if you have different versions of your API, you could have a header that says, if I pass in version 1, then I get one response. And then when you start versioning for version 2 or 3 or whatever, then you can have these different headers, and then you just have one default one. So if you don't pass it in, you always get the latest version of your API. But if you pass it in, you can get previous versions so that older clients can still get the same response as they expect. Sweet. So, but what about XML and custom response? Because the default for that is that you actually add dot or plus XML or plus JSON at the end. That's kind of what we normally do. That's the format that we use. We have the type plus the format that we want. I recently learned that you can actually pass in two headers like this, and due to a little weirdness in ASP.NET Core, this works well together. It kind of shouldn't, for different reasons, but it does in the way that it's being set up. Ignore that. You haven't seen that. I want to show you how to do it for real. So if I want to have XML here, I need to add plus XML here to make sure that it becomes XML. Right now, if I run this, JSON. JSON is the default. So what we're going to do in here, or what I'm going to do, is I'm going to go to my infrastructure folder, and I'm going to add some more stuff in here. I'm going to add, and this is going to be another one that I won't be able to spell, accept header output formatter selector. That looks pretty good. And since I only do projects where we do have snippets, I have snippets for this. So it looks like that. It is not the most complicated. It inherits from output formatter, has one method, select formatter. It takes a output formatter can write context and a list of formatters and a media type collection, and returns output formatter. Okay? If you read the spec on it, it's fairly simple. You get some information in about the request and the object that you're returning, and the list of output formatters, and then you select one of the ones registered based on the response. And what we need in here is, I need a little helper. Actually, we need this first, sorry. Accept header output selector format selector. So I have a constructor here. My constructor accepts some MVC options, so I can figure out what MVC has been configured with, and a logger factory, because well, I need the logger factory because I need that to be passed into the default output formatter selector, which is basically the default one in MVC. So I have a fallback selector. So if my output formatter selector can't find a specific formatter, it will just basically fall back to the one that comes with MVC. And that is why I need a logger factory here. And then I have a list of formatters. And the list of formatters here comes out of my MVC configuration. So MVC has a bunch of formatters configured, in my case too, JSON and XML. I'm just going to store those as well because I want to use them. And then I have a map here saying that if you see plus JSON, then this is the actual format that you're looking for. And if you see plus XML, this is the formatter that you actually want to use. With that in place, I need accept header output select formatter, that one. I have a little formatter here. Yes, there's a lot of code in here. But what we're doing is look at the accept header. If the accept header doesn't start with application/vnd dot, then I don't really care. So I'm just going to return the fallback selector, select formatter, and basically say, do whatever you would have done if I wasn't here. Use the fallback. After that, it looks at the passed in list of formatters, because once in a while you do get a list of formatters passed into this method as well. If there is none, then I use the predefined list that I got from ASP.NET or from MVC. Then I go and figure out the actual content type based on the accept header. I'll show you that in a second. And then I find a formatter that can handle my formatting of that content type. And then I change the content type to whatever I put into my accept header, and then I return my formatter. And the last little part down here is the get content formatter, that one. And my get content type from accept header looks at the accept header, it looks at the plus sign. If there is a plus sign, it basically takes the header, cuts it at the plus sign, looks at the last part, which is going to be XML or JSON in my case, and then it maps that last part against my dictionary, this thing here. And then based on whatever I get out of that, I go and ask the formatters to basically say, can you find a formatter that can do XML or JSON? Now that I have an accept header output formatter selector that I've written that can help me select which output formatter to use, I can just go to my startup file and we can do services, add singleton, and it's going to be an output formatter selector. Nope. Well, kind of. If I add it like that, saying that I want to register one of those and use one of those, and I do using statements for those two. Why did I output? Thank you. Output formatter selector, that thing there. With that in place, I now have my own custom formatter selector. So passing this in, it will first of all use application vnd.user to figure out to use my other type of object, and then that didn't work very well, did it? We are now mob programming. This became a soft skills talk. We're now doing mob programming. Sweet. There it is. It comes out as my smaller object in XML format, which is exactly what I want. So using this with my own custom types here, I can do versioning, I can do formatting, I can do all the things I want without having to add an ugly freaking thing to my URL in my REST endpoints. Make sense? Anybody think this is something that you would actually use? Okay, so there are a few smart people in here. Okay, I have a bit more time to go, so I'm going to go deep now. I'm going to go where very few people have gone before. Has anybody heard of hosting startup assemblies in ASP.NET Core? Not a single person. Me neither. Until I Googled it because I was curious. How many of you have used Application Insights? How many of you have used Application Insights in Azure? How many have gone to your web app in Application Insights, in Azure, and ticked the little box, said, I want Application Insights, and all of a sudden you get Application Insights installed into your ASP.NET Core application? Anybody wonder how that works? One hand, 2 hands. It is called 3 hands. It is called hosting startup assemblies, which is what I'm going to show you. This is really awesome, and I hope it works on my machine now. So what I'm going to do, I have this little project. Down here, I have a request diagnostics. Unfortunately, we don't have time for you to see the evil Hacksaw site, but I can explain that if somebody's interested. So what I've got is I've got a diagnostics log. This is the most stupid log you can think of. It basically just takes log entries and stores them in memory. And then you can tell it to serialize it, and it writes it to a diagnostics.log file in the same folder as your application. It's dumb. You're more than welcome to call it dumb. I'm okay with that. And then I have a Diagnostics Middleware, which is a middleware that plugs into the request pipeline and listens to /diagnostics if I am in development. If I am in development and go to that address, this thing will just magically appear in my website, and it's going to show me everything that is in my log. But the big thing here is that I am not going to touch my code to get it to work. It's just magically going to be there, I think. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a couple of helpers in here. The first thing we need, I'm going to go add new item. And I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to add a class called, what do I want first? I want the Diagnostics Startup Filter. So Diagnostics Startup Filter, that's my first part. And I'm going to do a Diagnostic Startup Filter, that's the one. So a diagnostic startup filter is a class that you, or an interface that you can implement. And when you do that, you get to play with the startup of your application. So you put this into your service collection, and then all the startup filters in your service collection will be allowed to play with your request pipeline before the application starts. So by just having my iStartup filter, it has a configure method that takes a callback that takes it takes an action with an iApplication builder. Next. And in here, I can just go and say app.use middleware. That's all I need to do. So basically, I get to play with this. So this is my callback. So I return a callback. So it's weird. It's actually a method. For C#, it's weird. It's a method that takes another method and returns a third method. So what I'm returning from my configure method is a method that can basically be used inside of your startup.cs file. So it's kind of, this part here is what you would normally put into your configure in your startup.cs. But this is going to be outside of your startup.cs and in a separate assembly. So the startup filter helps you to do startup-y things. Now, the startup-y things is kind of annoying because to be able to use that, I need to put it into my services collection. How do I get it into my services collection of an application that I have never seen? Kind of not the easiest thing to do. So what we need is we need another little helper. We need another class called Diagnostics Hosting Startup. Like that. So the Diagnostic Hosting Startup has an assembly attribute called Hosting Startup. And it points to itself. Very useful attribute. The reason it needs to point to itself is because it's assembly level, and it points to this class here. And any assembly in a hosting startup assembly that you point out that has that hosting startup attribute will be allowed to be part of starting up your app by implementing iHosting Startup. So iHosting Startup has a configure method, but instead of being equivalent to your configure in your startup.cs, it is actually plugging into this. So your create web host builder. So it plugs into your creation of your host and not into your actual request pipeline. This allows us to plug into the services collection of my application in a dynamic way. So in this case, I'm adding my Diagnostics Log, and I'm adding my magical little startup filter here, which is the thing that plugs into the request pipeline. So I have one class that allows me to add services, and by adding a service that implements iStartup filter, I now have a service that gets to play with the request pipeline. So I have both services and request pipeline access at the moment. That's kind of all I need. The next step is you go into the properties of your project, and you go to package, and you say, yes, dear Visual Studio, this is a Nougat package, and generate a Nougat package on build. So I tick that thing, generate Nougat package on build. Build this. Build generates a Nougat file, or nupkeg, or whatever it's supposed to be called, Nougat package. And it creates it in, as you can see, in the request diagnostics /bin /debug /request diagnostics.1.0.0.nupkeg. I, in my solution, have a little config or Nougat config file that actually tells me to tells Nougat to look into that folder. So I don't need to upload my package just for demo purposes. So I actually have a Nougat file or a Nougat config file that looks like this. So you put one of these somewhere in your project, and then I basically say, hey, you can find request diagnostics. Here is where you find other Nougat packages. So I'm not just using the public one, because that would force me to upload a package to a public repository. In this case, I can just read Nougat packages from my local machine instead. So it's just a little helper. So what I'm going to do now is, and this, I'm going to have to do it like this because I do it as a Nougat package. I will explain a little thing how you can get around that in a second. But In my case, I'm going to go and say manage Nougat packages in my project. Then I'm going to switch over to request diagnostics. And I'm going to go browse, and it's going to find my package that I just built. I'm going to install that. But Chris, Application Insights doesn't require you to add a Nougat package. No, it doesn't, because there's another way for you to put your Nougat packages in a defined place on the server that you're sending your application to. So that is what Azure is doing. On every VM that runs your web apps, there is a specified folder on that machine that includes the Application Insights Nougat package. And that is called a runtime store, and it needs to be configured. In my case, I can get around that by adding an actual reference to the Nougat package. But it means that I do it for demo, but if you want to do this for real, you can have a runtime store and not have to do the add Nougat package step. The only thing you need to do to get it to work if you have a runtime store is that you have to go to your whatever way you're launching your application. In my case, I'm going to run it through IIS. So I'm going to use this launch settings.json, but obviously on a real server, you would set the environment variable that I'm about to set on the server that you're deploying to. And in here, you set an environment variable called ASP.NET core underscore hosting startup assemblies, like that, I think. Hosting startup assemblies, that looks okay. Request diagnostics, like that. Did I spell it right? Request that looks pretty good. And just for the heck of it, I'm going to do it down here so we don't have different settings for different environments. Now, I haven't done anything inside of my application more than I added my environment variable to get that set up. That would, once again, be on your server as you deploy to a specific server. And I added a Nougat reference, which a runtime store would have fixed for you if you hadn't added a Nougat reference. And if I start this application now, you see nothing. Ta-da! Very impressive demo. /diagnostics. That was not what I wanted. /diagnostics. How cool is that? So I know it's a stupid demo. But the cool thing is that I actually managed to plug myself into the services collection of an application without actually touching the application. So if you're running in Azure, then you will do things like just tick the little box. But say that you were running on-prem and you wanted to make sure that certain features was put into every single ASP.NET Core application that was ever deployed in that server, you just define a runtime store, put your Nougat packages in that store, and then make sure that that environment variable was set to load that assembly, and then magically you would get a bunch of things installed into your application. So monitoring and things like that can just magically appear in your application by basically setting an environment variable or by even uploading your application to that server, and it just plugs into your application. I found that really awesome. Mostly because I hadn't seen it before and I get easily distracted by new things. So, last thing that I'm going to show you, I've got 10 minutes, I think, is something called model binding. Has anybody tried doing custom model binding? A few hands. So custom model binding has been around since MVC came out, pretty much. But if we have a look at my controllers here, my API controller, user controller, and we collapse that, we can see here that both of these get user methods actually takes a user ID. And then inside of both of them, I call users.where_ID is to get my actual user. It would be kind of nice if I just got the user, wouldn't it? Because every time I pass in a user ID, I do actually turn that into a user object. I need to go and fetch that somehow anyway. It would be kind of nice if the framework can do it for me. Imagine being able to take parameters in and have them converted into something else that you need before you start using them. Well, apparently it comes out that when you start Googling it, that actually having it run to the database before you get to your controller is apparently not recommended. But I'm going to do that anyway. what you would probably do instead is not run to the database, but imagine that you could have specific formats coming in. So there would be XML that was coming in, or there was JSON coming in, or YAML or whatever, and you could make sure to map that to the correct objects without having to do a bunch of things or something like that. But I'm going to go for the database thing because I found that to be the coolest demo. And that's what we live for, right? So I'm going to add a new class. I'm going to call it user model binder, like that. Nope, not at all like that. Where am I? There it is. Model binder. I'm going to add user model binder, like that. So a model binder is a class that implements iModel binder. Duh. Okay. Supports dependency injection. So I'm going to inject iUsers in here. So I have my users repo. And then the iModel binder has a method called bindModelAsync. It takes a model binding context, which is basically what you're working with at the moment, the current context of your request, and returns task. And if we take this thing here, we can go and say bind model async 1. So, a couple of weird things in here. It's a bit hard to work with the binding context, to be perfectly honest. I think the naming of things is a bit interesting. But first of all, I check to see if there is a binding context. I do believe that there always is, but all the demo code had it in there, so there might be situations where it's not there. So I check that. And then we start doing my actual code. So if we start looking here, binding context dot model metadata dot name plus ID. Okay. So model metadata dot name is the name of the property or the parameter coming into your controller. So that, in this case, user ID would be my model metadata dot name. In my case, I take that and I add ID to the end of it. But Chris, you're going to end up with user ID ID. Yes, I am, and that is not what I intend to do. I intend to rename this to user and have it be user like that instead. So when my model binder comes in and says, you want to have a user object, I'm going to assume, and the name of my parameter is user, I'm going to assume that somebody has passed in user ID in some form. In my case, it's going to come from the URL. So basically, it's going to have that thing there. So it's going to take user plus ID turns into user ID. So what I have in my key here is going to be user ID, hopefully. Then I ask for the value for that key. And if it returns none, then I just go, not touching that. Then we do bind model async 2. And then I go and pull out the first value of that property. So basically, what we do with value provider is telling it from the current context, if I ask you for a user ID, what are you going to return? It can return none. Basically, I didn't give you a user ID. You are useless. Or it can come back and say, hey, the first value that came back is going to be this. And then I compare if that's empty. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask, once again, I'm going to ask the context, user ID, what was the value of this parameter here? In my case, that's going to be a 1 or a 2 or whatever, because it's going to be the ID of the user. Then, once I figured out that they did pass in the user ID, I go and I try to parse that as an integer, because I know that all of my user IDs are going to be ints. So I try to parse that with the user ID. If I find it to be available and be an int, I take my user ID, I get my user from the database, and then I set the binding context.result to a model binding result success of user. Basically saying, yes, I managed to model bind your value to whatever you needed. If it didn't work, if I didn't get a user ID as an int, or I couldn't find the user in the database, or whatever could happen here. Actually, it's just the ID thing. Sorry, I haven't caught the fact that it couldn't be in the database. So if you pass in the wrong ID, it's going to break. Probably should have better code than that. But if you don't find a user ID of the type int, it's going to go and add a model error so that when you come to your controller and go, yeah, model state dot is valid, it's going to be false. And then there's going to be an error in here that says user ID must be a number. So with this thing, I do get access to all the information about what's happening here, the name of the parameter, the type that I'm trying to convert to, and all of that. And then I turn this code in here to basically go from user ID to user. that is part 1. Part 2 is adding something called a user model binder provider. I have 5 minutes left. So you're looking at the clock. And we're going to do user model binder provider. So what a user model binder provider does, it's a provider, it's called a user model binder provider. So it's a provider, and it provides model binders. Pretty self-explanatory. But what it does, it takes a model binder context, and it basically says, if the model type that you're trying to convert to is user, then use my model binder called user model binder. Otherwise, I have no idea how to convert this thing. So it basically says, depending on what you're trying to convert, use this. And then you use something called the binder type model binder, which is a model binder that wraps another model binder to get dependency injection. All of this is very well documented in online in ASP.NET Core's documentation. And the final thing we need to do once we've got our model binders set up is we need to go to MVC, options, options.modelbinderproviders.insert. You want to have it first because it goes in order. And if you forget to add your at the top, you're going to end up with having someone else go and say, hey, I know how to do it, and it's going to fail. So I want to insert it at the top, and then new user model binder provider. Like that. And I have my model binder provider in place. I have my model binder. If I go into my user controller now, I need to make one change in here because I don't need to pull this out anymore. So that code is useless. If I go back in here, put a breakpoint, go F5. Go in here, press F5, realize that I don't know how to code. Press F5 again. Go to my Insomnia instance that I apparently pulled down. And try and request a user. Request user, send. Straight into... Why did it not jump into where it wanted to be? Because I had my awesome header in place. Let's request the right one. There it is. It goes straight into my application, and I actually get a full user entity instead. So I don't have to get an ID and convert that into an entity on my own. Instead, I can just ask for the proper object, and I get that sorted out before it even comes to my end. So I don't have to do a bunch of manual stuff, which can be really nice. Since I apparently have a history of going over time, I've been reminded several times today. That is actually all I'm going to do today. If you want to have a look at the code, it's available there at that address. There is another demo in there that I haven't shown you, which is about adding anti-forgery tokens that I can explain if you're interested in how to do anti-forgery stuff in ASP.NET Core. I will be around, not tonight, because I'm going to run away from here now. But I'll be here the entire day tomorrow, so feel free to just catch me in the hallway, come over to our booth, have a chat if there's something you want to know. Thank you so much for listening.